Hi everyone! Today we're going to be going over a paper from 2012 by Maruyama and colleagues called The Cortical Representation of Simple Mathematical Expressions. So they begin the paper by noting that the origins of math have long been a topic of philosophical debate, and we have records of this dating back to antiquity. More and more these days, researchers seem to be agreeing that notions of number, space, and time are inherited from our evolutionary history and don't need to be explicitly learned. At any rate, in the historical context, the invention of verbal counting and number words could have catalyzed the invention of writing systems in ancient Sumer and Greece. Since math and writing are then historically related, the question can become whether linguistic principles are involved in mathematical logic. This is plausible because the nested hierarchical structures found in mathematical expressions resemble structural constituencies in natural language syntax. For example, the variable a is nested within the exponential operation in a squared, and the operation a squared plus b squared is nested on the left side of the entire expression. Some have even hypothesized that language is the glue or the substrate that allows us to generate more complex thoughts out of simpler ones. Basically, the idea is that the recursion that's so essential to human language could underlie all complex human skills. So let's fast forward from antiquity to the 15th century. At this stage, history observes a systematic decrease in the use of language and words among mathematicians. Now, the authors don't talk about this in the paper, but in the 1400s, it likely would have been Islamic mathematicians spearheading these innovations. So it was around this time that mathematical logic seemed to move from a less linguistic form into a more symbolic form of its own, using well-defined operators and syntactic markers, like the ones we know today. For example, the slash in 2/5 translates to 2 divided by 5, and the parentheses surrounding 1 plus 3 nest it within the entire operation of 2 times 1 plus 3. This brings us to the main question of the paper. Is math indeed a linguistic skill? Many trained mathematicians have actually expressed the intuition that math is a more visuospatial skill, as the researchers illustrate with this quote from Albert Einstein that they open the paper with. And the quote goes like this: "Words and language, whether written or spoken, do not seem to play any part in my thought process. The psychological entities that serve as building blocks for my thought are certain signs or images, more or less clear, that I can reproduce and recombine at will." So what evidence do we have that math may not be linguistic? For one, patients with global aphasia or semantic dementia sometimes retain arithmetic skills. This shows that the two skills, or at least the most essential aspects of the skills, are localized in structurally distinct areas of the brain. There was also a study in 2003 that showed when you have lesions in the left parietal area, which is not a classical language area, it selectively impairs the conceptual link between numerals and their real quantities. This is essentially abolishing the semantic meaning behind a numeral. They also give some multimodal evidence that some numerical tasks don't need linguistic mediation, but overall, all of this is to say that it is possible for mathematical concepts to exist independently of language or linguistic skills. So yes, mathematical concepts can exist independently of language. This is excellently illustrated by psycholinguistic case studies from speakers of Amazonian and Australian languages. The psycholinguists studying these languages and their usage found that even though the languages had a highly reduced number of vocabulary compared to the world's dominant languages, the speakers were still able to master complex numerical and geometrical concepts. Studies like this aimed to determine if a language's set of conceptual vocabulary directly affected a person's understanding of the world, and long story short, this has been shown to be sometimes true and sometimes not. The bottom line is that the language a person speaks does not conceptually restrict them. Taking the different aspects of language and mathematics into consideration, the question now becomes, do similar aspects of these two skills, such as syntax and recursion, share a similar neural basis? It seems that some aspects of math are linguistic and others aren't. The authors venture a guess to fix this confusion. Perhaps previous studies have just failed to disentangle the many aspects of language and math. Human language has unique aspects that it doesn't share with math, such as phonology, which refers to the rules that govern the arrangements of sounds in a given language, and morphology, which refers to the rules that govern how complete words are formed from smaller bits of words like prefixes, roots, and suffixes. Math has a couple of pseudo-unique components, such as quantity and operators, although you could argue that mathematical operations are just the math version of a verb. The two domains share several aspects, mainly in the existence of recursion and a highly regularized syntax. So then naturally, we as neuroscientists can ask, do parts of these two skills share similar neural bases? So in answering this question, the researchers chose a design which combined fMRI and MEG, and this was because they wanted to maximize both their spatial and temporal resolution. fMRI can give you excellent spatial resolution, but not so good temporal data, while MEG is pretty good at temporal precision, but is only spatially approximate. The participants consisted of 24 native French speakers, of whom 22 were right-handed and 2 were ambidextrous. You might be wondering why they're reporting this, but it's because in linguistic studies, it's always important to pay attention to handedness. This is because handedness has been shown to affect language lateralization in the brain, in that language is typically lateralized to the left hemisphere, but especially in left-handed individuals, it can occasionally be lateralized to the right hemisphere. With 5 females and 19 males, the study is not well matched on sex, and they also didn't mention whether the participants were monolingual or bilingual, and this is potentially problematic, especially in a syntax study, because non-Romance languages with rich morphosyntax, like German or Turkish, could introduce a potential confound if the speakers have knowledge of those languages. Stimuli for the experiment were strings of 11 symbols, always comprising the 4 digits 1 to 4, 2 plus signs, and 1 minus sign, and 2 pairs of round parentheses. The ordering of these symbols resulted in 4 levels of expression complexity, ranging from completely random at level 0 to increasing levels of constituent nesting to where level 3 was a fully formed, syntactically correct mathematical expression. The lower levels were generated by breaking successive layers of nodes, beginning with the top node of the syntactic tree. Also, shuffled orders weren't allowed to result in anything mathematically meaningful, like 2 numbers separated by an operator or 2 numbers side by side, which could be seen as a newly created 2-digit number. I wanted to show you guys how these diagrams from their first figure compare to syntactic trees in linguistics, so I pulled some examples from a lecture from an old syntax class. Here's one that shows the noun phrase, the adorbs brown puppies, which is just a cute sentence fragment. And here's a longer full sentence that shows how constituents of a sentence can be embedded deeper and deeper within a syntactic tree. You can see how it might be easy to recursively add more clauses to this sentence by making more and more nested nodes on the right-hand side, and this is what the authors mean when they say that both language and math are recursive skills. So for the actual task, when the subjects are either under fMRI or MEG imaging, they first view the yellow dot on the left side of figure B. From there, they're briefly presented with a mathematical string, and then the screen changes back to the yellow dot, and then they're presented with a second mathematical string. In 50% of the trials, the second string is identical to the first, but in the other half of the trials, there are either 2 swapped digits or 2 swapped operators. The task is essentially that the participants must judge whether the 2 strings that they view are different or the same. Using this paradigm, they put each participant through 8 MEG runs and 7 through 8 fMRI runs, where each run had 40 trials, so quite a few trials at the end of the day. This paradigm was chosen because the researchers guessed that it would require no active syntactical parsing. Because of that, the researchers expected to be able to probe the automatic processing of algebraic structure. The researchers collected T2 star-weighted functional images during the task, as well as non-functional anatomical images. They also did something called a functional localizer in order to locate brain areas involved in vision, left and right hand motor commands, reading, speech listening, and mental calculation. And this will be important later for the analyses. Throughout the course of MEG data acquisition and analysis, the researchers needed to remove artifacts that result from bodily and environmental factors, like blinking, heartbeat, power lines, and muscle contraction, including saccadic contraction. This is because such factors can contaminate the signal. and here's an MEG machine illustrated there. Now the idea behind MEG is that a current traveling through a cylinder, such as an electrical wire or a neuron, will induce a magnetic field around the cylinder. Luckily for us, those teeny tiny magnetic fields, which are around the order of pico or femtoteslas, can be detected with the electrodes contained in the MEG. Additionally, and critically for this study, MEG is very temporally precise. First, let's take a look at the behavioral results. The behavioral responses in the two imaging modalities were not statistically different, so the researchers merged it all together. They found that operator swapping was the most difficult change to catch, accounting for roughly 40% of all the errors. Higher syntactical organization resulted in a lower error rate and lower reaction time pretty much across the board, which may indicate that the structure of these expressions are implicitly processed and useful in recall. Using an ANOVA, they found that the differences in error rate between the complexity levels were highest in the operator swap condition and lower in the digit swap condition. This may mean that the encoding of operators depends on the encoding of the overall syntactic structure, while digits are, to quote the authors, free-floating semantic elements that are easily remembered regardless of the syntactic frame. Response times also were affected by syntax in that judgments were increasingly faster as syntactic structure increased. Interestingly, as the position of swapped symbols moved from left to right, there were higher error rates and longer reaction times. The authors guessed that this could reflect the reading direction of the participants, since French, like all Romance languages, is read from left to right. But a similar experiment should be done in participants that are literate in a right-to-left language, like Japanese or Arabic, in order to see if this is the reason. The researchers also found higher error rates and reaction times when a digit swap was done around a plus operator than around a minus operator. They guessed that this could be because addition is a commutative property and subtraction is not, and because of that, participants may not pay as much attention to the ordering of the digits that surround the plus sign. To summarize, participants' performance was sensitive to the structural complexity of expressions as well as their left-to-right branching, and even the semantics of the plus or minus operators that they contained. Alright, let's dig into some brain figures. Now, figure 3 from the paper, shown on the right of the slide, shows the brain regions significantly affected with syntactic complexity. They observed that higher syntactic complexity was actually associated with decreased activation in these areas, and the areas represented here are the left lateral occipital cortex, the left fusiform cortex, and then the right intraparietal, right precentral, right lateral occipital, and right fusiform cortex. There seems to be a lot to this figure at first glance, but the line graphs are all saying similar things about the 6 brain regions. When we look at the graphs, we see that each region is showing a decreased signal across all swapping conditions as syntactic complexity increases. The researchers also found that these effects were larger in the right hemisphere than in the left hemisphere. Notice that this effect holds over all swapping conditions. This could indicate that the effect is actually related to the syntactic complexity of the expression. So it turns out that 17 of the 24 participants had completed the functional localizer that I mentioned earlier. One part of the localizer actually involved mental calculations. So during the localizer, they were presented with either a written problem to solve or they were audibly told to solve a problem. For example, they could have been told, "What is 11 minus 7? The 3 panels on the left of the figure show brain activation from these localizers in blue, along with brain activation associated with syntactic complexity in red. They found that calculation and complexity overlapped in the right intraparietal region and the right precentral region, and that calculation and complexity areas were adjacent to one another in the fusiform visual word form area. They also compared brain activation during all swapped trials with the complexity associated activation, again in red. Here in the right panels, yellow was activation associated with swapped digits, and green was activation associated with swapped operators. Here they found that the right inferior parietal region was more active in both of the swapping conditions than in the same condition, and also that the medial part of this region overlapped with the complexity associated region. So far in their analyses, the researchers had not found a region of the brain that was positively associated with increasing syntactic complexity. So they try a few more things. First, they searched the whole brain for areas with a positive linear effect of syntactic complexity over all 24 subjects. This approach did not reveal anything, so they tried by searching within 8 regions of interest. They tried this ROI approach next because it could have greater sensitivity than the previous whole brain approach. And fortunately, the ROI approach did reveal that the left putamen exhibited a small monotonic increase in brain activation with increasing syntactic complexity. Then they did a single subject analysis of the 17 subjects that had data for a language localizer, which is a subset from the functional localizers from earlier. Here they used the same 8 ROIs as in the last slide. This approach identified 3 regions in total, and those regions were the inferior frontal gyrus pars triangularis, the IFG pars orbitalis, and the posterior superior temporal gyrus. Although the increases seen here were statistically significant, if you look at the line graphs showing signal change in each region, you'll see that they were pretty weak and monotonic. There especially seems to be a big effect from the level 1 syntactic complexity. In summary of the fMRI analyses, the researchers found that brain regions associated with mathematical syntactic complexity did not overlap with areas previously associated with language syntax. They do note that there were weak positive effects of math complexity in language-focused ROIs, but overall brain activation negatively correlated with syntactic complexity in posterior, occipital, and fusiform regions, as well as the right intraparietal and right precentral cortex. The researchers also observed an interesting effect concerning the side of the expression on which the parentheses appeared. This occurred in the level 3 expressions especially, which as a reminder are the expressions that are syntactically complete and have the highest syntactic complexity. Essentially, the side of the expression that the nested parentheses was on induced greater activation in the contralateral side of the brain's occipital pole. That is, a subject viewing a mathematical expression with parentheses nested on the left side would have greater occipital activation in their right hemisphere. The same effect was replicated in level 2 expressions, but not so much in level 1 expressions. The researchers examined this effect within the level 1 expressions and found that in expressions with correctly formed parentheses, for example those that open and close around something, the contralateral effect remained. This suggests that the contralateral effect relies on the correct placement of the parentheses and not on the syntax. Now we finally move to the MEG results. The MEG results revealed 3 clusters of activity that were significantly positively associated with syntactic complexity. Note that this is the opposite of what was observed in the fMRI results, where brain signal was negatively associated with syntactic complexity. The first cluster began in the right parieto-temporal region, and the second was in the left parieto-temporal and frontal regions. The third was in the entire right hemisphere. They then used a method called linearly constrained minimum variance to selectively amplify relevant signals. Doing this helped them identify several right hemisphere regions positively associated with increased syntactic complexity, and those were inferior temporal, posterior parietal, and lateral occipital regions. Now let's summarize the study's main findings. In the behavioral domain, the researchers found that the amount of syntactic structure in a mathematical expression was positively associated with the subject's ability to make more accurate judgments in the same different task. Meanwhile, fMRI analysis showed that several regions were associated with the syntactic complexity of the mathematical expressions. These regions were bilateral fusiform and lateral occipital cortices, as well as right inferior parietal and several precentral regions. Several language ROIs were also investigated and were found to be weakly positively associated with syntactic complexity. These regions included the IFG, both pars triangularis and pars orbitalis, as well as the posterior STS and putamen. MEG analysis showed that the first effect of syntactic complexity occurred around 140 milliseconds in the right occipitotemporal area, which was then followed by signal from the right posterior parietal, occipital, and precentral areas, all lying outside of classical language areas. The fMRI results showing fusiform activation suggest that mathematical parsing could rely on the fusiform cortex and could be related to visual word recognition. It's notable here that the fusiform region that the researchers identified as being related to mathematical complexity lies very close to the classical visual word form area and the fusiform face area. The VWFA and the FFA are part of the ventral visual pathway, which is related to spatial processing, which the researchers say suggests that the initial parsing of mathematical expressions could be spatial in nature, and that this would actually resemble word recognition more than syntactic sentence parsing. The VWFA is also known to be involved in parallel word processing, which means that a word is recognized and read as a whole rather than letter by letter. The authors say that the speed of the initial MEG signal occurring at 140 milliseconds suggests that the mathematical expressions are also processed in parallel to some degree. They further speculate that the early 140 millisecond parallel parsing stage is probably crude and based on parentheses and operators, and that full processing may require a later serial stage where the subjects move through constituents to perform each nested calculation. However, this would require further investigation, likely using MEG to track this two-stage process. Here we turn to the issue of the dissociation between the fMRI and the MEG results. As a reminder, the researchers found that as syntactic complexity increased, MEG signal increased, but fMRI signal decreased. This phenomenon has been reported in other studies and could reflect two different activities being performed: an initial positive feed-forward processing seen in the MEG and a later negative sustained activity seen in the fMRI. They guess this because when active feed-forward processing is involved, you usually see a positive effect of syntactic structure, which makes sense because in active parsing you need to work harder to parse more complicated structures. However, when the task involves memory, like in this study, you tend to see more activation being evoked by nonsense words than by real words. This makes sense when you consider that nonsense words require more effort to keep in your working memory. This same principle could transfer to the participants needing to work harder to keep nonsense strings in their working memory in order to perform the same different judgment. So what about language areas of the brain? The authors mentioned that in their previous research, increasing syntactic complexity in language stimuli increased activation in classical language areas. But in the present study of mathematical complexity, language regions showed very weak associations to mathematical syntactic complexity. It's worth noting that these regions listed here are known to be involved in syntax, so it's possible that they may be involved in learning arbitrary syntactic structure or rules. However, the researchers note that we should be wary about these regions' activity, because it's possible they could be artifacts from the tendency to name mathematical expressions on some trials. And supporting evidence that mathematical syntactic processing is distinct from language comes from agrammatic aphasics, who can retain skills for arithmetic and algebraic manipulation, even when they're unable to use grammar in their speech and writing. An explanation that the authors postulate for this separation of domains is that maybe in the adult participants, mathematical ability has been compiled into the more spatial occipito-visual cortical areas, and because of this, the skill is overwhelmingly more spatial than linguistic in nature. But of course, this study should be replicated in children of different stages of development in order to answer this question. There was also the unexpected result that the placement of parentheses activated the contralateral occipital pole, which suggests that initial algebraic parsing could recruit early visual processing because of the trained visual relevance of parentheses. Another possibility is that left and right parentheses may be grouped according to closure instead of proximity because of a process called contour integration. An important aspect of contour integration is that it can be sensitive to training. So the idea is that participants will have learned that parentheses are syntactically relevant to math because of their educational training. Therefore, the effect of contour integration will be enhanced and they will find parentheses more visually relevant. So to conclude, the study was done in 24 adults and found that mathematical expressions are parsed at an early visual level in bilateral ventro-occipito-temporal cortices, and interestingly, not in classical language areas. Some limitations of the study include the fact that results are limited to elementary arithmetic expressions and don't delve into operators such as square roots or integrals. Additionally, The same different judgment task was more difficult in the nonsense level 0 expressions because of the increased working memory load. They note that this effect was not entirely intended. Moreover, the presence of parentheses could have been a major confound because the ordering of parentheses becomes more correct as the complexity level increased. And finally, participants may have attempted to perform the calculations that were presented to them during the task, and this would have introduced additional confounds because they weren't asked to actually perform the computations. Thank you guys for your attention. I hope that you got something out of this video. I definitely had fun making it, and hopefully we'll make some more soon. Thanks.